Hey everyone, welcome to my channel Alpha Genesis. I am feeling really cozy today, so I am in my pajamas. I will be going out a little bit later, which is why you kind of see me a little bit more made up, but you know, it's just such a nice day today and I wanted to enjoy some time inside. It's even raining outside and it's really nice to, for once, have it be raining but be able to stay inside and just cuddle up in my bed and, you know, just do some learning. So it is interview season. For those of you who don't know, it's currently interview season for Ph.D. programs, which for those of you who don't know means that prospective students have applied to their Ph.D. programs and are now hearing back from the schools about whether they'll get interviews or not. It has been highly requested for me to do a video about interviews, and I have heard you and I'm gonna bring that to you. Sorry it took a little while. There were some videos I wanted to get out first, like my New Year's resolution video, but this video will be just in time for interview season, so I want to just share my experiences with you. So I'm just gonna jump straight into it, but before I start, I do want to mention that the interviews I'm going to be talking about are my experiences with interviews. I'm going to be talking about my application, my experiences in my field, which is like molecular cellular biology. What I describe is not the same in every field. For example, there are some fields that don't have interviews at all, some fields where interviews are more competitive than others, etc. I'm just gonna be talking to you about my personal experiences with interviewing, so I would love to hear your experiences about how interviewing has been different for your field or in your experience. Just don't necessarily think that like my interview is gonna be what your interview is like. So basically the way I'm gonna format this video is I'm gonna give kind of an overview of how biology PhD interviews work for like molecular cellular biology, and then I'm actually gonna talk about each of my interviews and how they went. This video would be an excellent companion to my previous video, which is about my actual application itself and what schools I ended up getting into. Alright, so basically a general overview for how biology, like molecular cellular biology PhD programs work. Once you submit your application, generally like maybe after like 3 weeks to a month, you'll get an interview invite. And that usually consists of an email, though it can be different for different schools. So basically in my experience, the way that this has worked is around, you know, a couple weeks after you submit your application, you should hear back from the school about whether you got an interview or not. Generally what happens is if you don't get an interview, you just don't hear back from the school at all. But if you do get an email or something, it's usually an interview invite. And an interview can be many different things. In my experience, it's like an on-site interview where you actually get to go to the school. But I do know that some schools like Caltech, for example, want to have phone interviews first before an on-site. And when you receive this interview completely depends on the school and their interview dates. So for example, I received my interview invites from Harvard very quickly. Usually I think it was like 2 weeks after the application, right before the Christmas holiday. And then I received my interview from Stanford like in mid-January, because their interview date is like way later than everyone else's. So there's not just like one universal date, you know, like don't freak out about not getting an interview invitation. Some schools notify people in batches and some schools send the interview invites like all in one day. So for example, I know my program, Harvard BBS, will send the interviews all out like in one day. And generally, if you want to know whether you got an interview or not, you can go to this forum called Grad Cafe. People like post, you know, whether they got certain interviews. And generally, for a lot of programs, if you didn't get an interview that day, it usually means you just didn't get an interview and you probably won't hear back until like way later that you didn't get one. But another way of knowing is just like call the school and ask when they're gonna send their interviews out. You know, you're not necessarily harassing them by just asking what their timeline is. Just like don't harass them though. And there, like I said, there are some schools that will send interviews out in different batches. I don't know too much about that because I didn't apply to any schools that are like that, but just be aware of how the schools you're applying to conduct their program. And the best way to find out about that is do your research. You're applying to a research program, you're trying to show them that you are a good researcher, so just go on their website, do your research, call them, etc. Like the initiative is on you to find out. But eventually you'll find out, like, you know, if like 2 months have passed and the interview date has passed, you probably didn't get one. So as I mentioned in my previous video, I applied to 7 schools, or I guess 7 programs. I applied to Harvard BBS, Harvard MCO, UC Irvine MCB, I believe it was, UC Merced's Quantitative and Systems Biology program, MIT, UCLA, I'm missing one, Stanford Biology. And I got interviews to 5 of them. I didn't get interviews to MIT or UCLA. I just didn't hear back from them until basically April or May that I didn't get an interview and that I didn't get in. So I just kind of figured that when February passed and I hadn't heard anything. I received email invitations for all of my interviews, though again, this can be different because I am not an international student. I know sometimes things can be different for international students, but I think generally programs will send you an email invitation. And usually the email invitation, at least for molecular and cell biology programs, is an on-site interview. They invite you to come to the school and meet with the program directors, meet with faculty members. And yes, they fly you out. Ph.D. programs are awesome. I know you don't make as much money going to medical school, but at least you don't have to spend thousands of dollars trying to figure out what school you would like to go to. If I could give you advice for anything in this process, it would be please don't necessarily have a number one top choice until you go to your interviews. And the reason I say that is because you can develop an idea of what a program is actually like based on the faculty members and the website and talking to students, but you don't actually get a vibe for what it's like until you're actually there. And originally, I really wanted to stay in California, so while I did apply to Boston schools, because I've lived in Boston before and I knew that is a place outside of California I would go, the Boston schools were actually my last choice. And then after I went on interviews, my list completely flipped and I ended up loving the East Coast schools. Have an open mind about all the schools you go to. You don't know what a school is really like or what a program is really like until you actually go. Alright, so now the general lay of the land for the interviews. So I went to every interview I got, which was honestly so exhausting. For context, I was a senior in college, and so I made sure to actually be a part-time student that semester because I knew I was going to be going on a lot of interviews, and that meant missing school and everything. I made sure to get thesis and fellowship applications and all that stuff out of the way first semester, so this semester would be a little bit more chill. But even after that, I was still really exhausted. I was in California, and what ends up happening is that schools will end up flying you out to their school, or, if you're close by, for example, UC Irvine, I just drove out. Generally, what I saw was that the format of the interview went as follows. There was a day where people would be coming in and you could get dinner of some sort with a host and a bunch of other students. And then the next day was the big day, the program information day, where they told you all about the program. And then also you would have faculty interviews where you would meet with the faculty members and they would ask you a bunch of questions. So usually after interviews were done, people were pretty exhausted and they would take you out to lunch where you again could meet prospective students who were also interviewing with you, as well as students that were already in the program. And you got to pretty much ask them anything you wanted. They wanted you to be curious about the program. That being said, in my opinion, especially now that I've gone through recruitment and was one of the batch of students who helped with recruitment, the students aren't there to grill you or see how smart you are or whatever. If you do anything really terrible, say incredibly racist things or getting naked and dancing on a table, that probably won't reflect on you well. But in general, this is your space to actually ask questions about the program and student life, not really to impress the students or anything. And usually then after that, there would be some sort of game night or party or some really low-key thing. And then the next day wouldn't really be a program focused day. It would just be trying to sell you on the area. And then that was it. You would go home and that was the interview. So generally, if you came for that first day where people are kind of flying in, the interviews were generally a 3 to 4 day process. I think closer to 3, otherwise people were getting pretty exhausted. Okay, so now talking about my individual interviews. I don't remember the exact timeline of when I did my interviews, so I may be getting some things mixed up. But first I got my emails for my Harvard BBS and Harvard MCO interview. So first I received emails from Harvard BBS and Harvard MCO that I got an interview, and then I received an invite from UC Irvine. And so I think basically what happened was Harvard MCO scheduled me for their first weekend. Harvard BBS let me pick which weekend, and then UC Irvine also let me pick which weekend. But I think the ways like the interview dates were set, I wouldn't have been able to go to all 3 interviews if I didn't change my MCO interview. I know this is a big question people have, if like there's any sort of advantage to being like in the first weekend versus the second weekend. And while I'm under the impression that there isn't, because, you know, deadlines change and stuff, that may not be true for every program. So again, I would ask the program coordinators individually. And so I ended up changing my MCO weekend to be the second weekend, and I did the Harvard BBS weekend that original weekend. So then, and somehow I ended up putting in UC Irvine after that. So basically what ended up happening was I had a full 10-day stretch in Boston, which was really great because I did not want to fly like to the East Coast multiple times, especially given that I didn't get an interview at MIT. This was just kind of like my one and done deal with them. And then I got an interview for UC Merced, which I was really excited about because I knew the program and I had worked there before, and it's a really great campus. And then I received my interview invitation from Stanford. I think it was like January 11th or something like mid-January. Because the UC Merced and Stanford interview invites were a little bit later, there were really no conflicts that I had to worry about for that. So I had 5 interview dates set, and the order of which was one weekend I had my Harvard BBS interview, then the next weekend was my Harvard MCO interview, and I think I had like one weekend off or something, which like I had to take a midterm or something, and then my UC Irvine interview, and then I think the next weekend after that I had my UC Merced interview, and then I think I had 2 weeks, and then I had my Stanford interview. So if I'm recalling correctly, and I'll correct this if this is not true, I had 5 interviews in 7 weeks. And every week I had off, I had like a midterm or something big. So that was very hectic. So first I went to my BBS interview, and this was my first one. And so I was really panicked about like what I was gonna wear, because I had never like tried to dress professionally or anything in the winter. But what I really liked was that the email for recruitment it started off with like a welcome to BBS recruitment or something. So it made it kind of sound like you were basically already accepted. And back in those days, that actually kind of was the case. I think BBS did a lot of what I call chopping block at the application stage, and then they mostly accepted people from the interviews, like most of them. I know it has changed recently due to like Harvard politics or something, so take that with a grain of salt. But when I applied, if you got an interview, you were like 90% probably gonna get in. And they just wanted you to be like casual, maybe not like jeans or anything, but like nothing too fancy, nothing like a suit or anything. And that's the vibe I got from all of my interviews, especially the Harvard ones where it was snowing. Like, they would be probably very confused if, you know, you were wearing like a full track suit in the snow. I think they just wanted you to generally look put together. And so the way my Harvard BBS interview went was I flew in really late because, again, I was flying in from the West Coast and I had lab that I couldn't miss, so it was like really hectic. So my host just like saved me dinner. I missed that like student dinner that people have when they first arrive. And then the next morning there was a, you know, BBS info session where they told us about the program. And then we had, I believe, interviews with 4 faculty members. And this was kind of unique. It was very different than the rest of my interviews because they kind of just gave us a map and our faculty, and then like told us to go. And for those of you who don't know, the Longwood area, the medical school area, is very big and confusing. So that was a lot. It kind of felt like, okay, you know, you're applying to this big program. Are you independent enough to actually like even get to your interviews? Again, I think because of student feedback that has changed and they now encourage the host to take people to their interviews. But that was something uniquely BBS that, you know, I actually kind of liked for some reason. Now, in terms of interview questions, I loved my BBS interviews. They were just really chill. I think they were trying to get to know me as a person. Again, that was, I think, because back then the vibe of BBS was like, you know, you're basically already in. Can you like have a conversation? Can you describe your research? I think they just want to make sure that like you know how to describe your work and make sure that, you know, you were actually intellectually thinking your work out, but also like, did you actually write your application? You know, like anyone could technically write it for you, but if you can't talk intelligently about your work, then that's a big red flag. And so first, usually I was asked questions like, so tell me about what you did in undergrad. What research did you do? Some of the faculty members had my CV, so they would actually look at it and be like, oh, I see that you did northern elephant pup research, like tell me about that. And so I would describe the work that I did over the summer, and we would just get into discussions about like why that model organism was like really cool. And it just felt like a conversation between like two fun scientists, you know, like they weren't grilling me necessarily on my work. They were like, oh, but so, that's interesting. Why did you make that choice? You know, why did you study it that way? But it was a discussion. It wasn't like a grill session, you know, which I really, really appreciated. For, I think, my first interview, we kind of ended up pivoting away from my science, and we just talked about science communication in general and politics, which I know people say you shouldn't talk about politics in your interviews. I wasn't really talking about like US politics, but the politics of science. The science institution has really failed in reaching out to people and making a strong connection with the public. And so I just had a really great discussion with my first interviewer about that. And I know most researchers will talk about their own work, but actually for my first like 3 interviews, we didn't talk about their work at all. We were just like getting into these really awesome topics. My next interview was with this person who I think like was kind of over like talking about science that day or something, or maybe he just wanted to like have an interesting conversation. So he just kind of looked at my CV and he was like, oh, you studied abroad here, do you speak Spanish? And I would talk about, yeah, like I do. And we just kind of talked about my background and my study abroad experience, and then we kind of just delved into like the history of Latin America, which is not what I was thinking I would be talking about in a bio Ph.D. interview. But that's what I'm saying, like these interviews are kind of informal based on like what that faculty member would like to talk about, and I think it gives you a good vibe for what the program is like. During my interviews, I was getting a very clear idea that BBS faculty members really cared about science and they were very intelligent, but that they could also have other conversations and really engage with their students. I think my third interview went similarly, and then my fourth interview was a little bit more scientific. We talked about my work and why I made certain decisions I did. Some questions that I got from this interviewer that I didn't get from others were things like, well, what future directions would you take this project in if you had to keep doing the project? Or what's something you had more trouble with during your experience? But I never felt like I was being grilled or anything. It just felt like this researcher was legitimately curious as to what it was like to work in these different fields. And then we ended up pivoting to talking about her work. She gave me a presentation, and then time was up. And that was that. I had a blast during those interviews, and I felt I could have intelligent conversations in many different realms, and that these faculty members actually cared about their students. It was really nice. Then after that, BBS took us out to this dinner. They took us to the Prudential Center, which is this very tall building in Boston. It like has a top floor where you can see like a whole view of all of Boston, and it's so cool. During that dinner, we were seated with both current students, prospective students, and faculty. And there, the faculty members, I don't think were in a capacity of like, you know, we're trying to recruit this student really hard, like, or trying to eliminate people. I think they were just there to answer questions. And the reason I think that is because I spent some time with a faculty member basically grilling him on like why he moved to Boston, like why should I move here when, you know, the weather is dreary and I've heard like these really intense things about Harvard, blah, blah, blah. And he took it, but he gave me really great answers. And I was very impressed. I don't think he probably liked me after that dinner. In fact, I think the vibe that I was giving out during the interview process was that I didn't like the program, and that was told to me by a current student when I was applying that I had already known. He was like, I didn't think that you were actually gonna come here because it just didn't seem like you enjoyed your interview. But I think what it was is I really wanted to make the case for why I should come here. And I ended up having such great discussions that I fell in love. But while I was there during the interview, I was like, this is nice. I really like this. I really like talking to people here. It didn't feel like this is my dream school, I just got positive vibes. Then later that night, there was a game night, and I had such a blast during that game night. I got to nerd out a little bit more and, see that people at this program can have fun without alcohol. They also had a pub night going on the side, but to me, it was really important to feel like I didn't have to mold myself into like this person that I wasn't in order to have fun in grad school. And to be honest, looking back, I think it was the game night that sold me. So then the next day, it started a lot later because again, there was a pub night and a lot of students would probably be hungover or just like really tired. I personally came late because I was really jet lagged, but anyway, I got brunch with my host and there were student talks and faculty talks. So the students were in the program and they were talking about the work they were doing, and the faculty members were, I think, new faculty members who were talking about the work that they would like to start. And then after that, there was a student panel, which was super great. I felt like the student panel was not necessarily just about the program. Of course, people had questions about the program, but I really liked that it was just about, gauging and getting advice for like, what is it like to be a graduate student? What is it like to move across the country, from a warm place to a cold place? Things like that, just anything. And I really liked that. Then after that, there were these events that kind of helped you get to know the area a little bit more. So for example, there was a brewery tour and a housing tour. I don't remember the other option, but you could also just not do anything and that was fine. So I went on the brewery tour and it was just a really fun place to socialize with fellow interviewees, and I made a lot of friends during that, and it was honestly really great. We had dinner at a faculty member's house, which was cool. We got to meet professor and, be with a bunch of students, have more intentional conversation, and phenomenal food. Amazing. And then I think the very last thing was, this changes depending on the weekend, but the weekend I was there, we were at the Natural History Museum that Harvard has over on the Cambridge campus, and it was just like mingling with fellow interviewees and faculty, and actually the entire program is invited to come. And so to this day, I still go to that event to just meet prospective students and, answer any questions they might have. So that was my BBS interview. I ended up staying in Boston for a few days before my MCO interview. Because I am a BBS student and I've done recruitment already, I kind of have the best idea of how the BBS interview went. I'm not going to be as specific with my other interviews because I don't necessarily remember every single day and like how it was structured, but I'll try my best. For MCO, again, there was kind of this like dinner thing for students who had just come in that night. It was just waiting for everyone to come in. I know a lot of people couldn't come in because there was a snowstorm or something, which made me grateful that I had come to Boston a week earlier. So I think we went to Shake Shack and we were again talking with current students and prospective students, and it was a nice time. I remember initially feeling like, this is interesting. Like, I don't feel as connected to these students as I did before, but okay. My BBS interviews, I stayed with my host, but for all of my other interviews, I had a hotel, and I stayed at the Harvard Square Hotel and had a really great roommate who I'm still friends with to this day, and that was really nice. It was nice to feel connected to someone that night because I don't think I had connected as well to people like during our dinner. And then the next morning was again like the big get to know this program, get to know all the cool things about us, and interview day. And from my recollection, everything just felt like really rushed. Like I felt like there was constant like intensity over and over and over again. and I was kind of worn out, and I didn't know if that was because of my previous interview that I had just had, like I already had one, I was pretty tired, or if it was just really intense. But I just remember feeling like there wasn't really much of a break. And these interviews were definitely a little bit more different. I felt like they were more science focused, but again, they were the same types of questions. They were like, what work did you do? Explain it. Explain how you got to a certain result. Why did you go in this direction, not that direction? Again, like very conversational. I did have one very intense interviewer who had a very, very good poker face, and I just like couldn't tell if I was really connecting with this professor. That person did ask me like, where are you planning on rotating? And then gave me advice about one of the places I was gonna rotate, because this person had heard that the department had a bad reputation and was, you know, keeping an eye out for me. And I really appreciated that. That's when I thought like, okay, I did connect with this person. The thing that made that interview hard, I think, was because of the poker face. I wasn't getting as much like positive feedback as I had been from the other interviewers, but I've been in situations like that before, so I wasn't really fazed. But it could be very unnerving for other people, and I would have completely understood. Actually, one thing that was interesting was this person was asking me to kind of like sketch out my data. I was basically going to describe it, and she was going to sketch it out to see if like the way I described the data is how it actually looked, if she was able to understand me properly. And I actually thought that was really cool and a really fun time, because I got to be like, oh no, actually like these were the two groups I had, and you know, I was really thinking intentionally about how I was describing my data, which was awesome. Then I believe there was a dinner, but it's kind of hazy still. After dinner, there was a game night. I think I went to the housing tour and that became a game night. But again, I was just thinking like, oh, I don't think I connect to like these students or these faculty members as well as I did the other ones, but it was kind of hard to gauge. And then kind of like between faculty interviews and like between these times, you could always go to like the MCO office. I think it was like the home base to just like talk to people. And I remember feeling really tired and just like I had all of my energy ready to have these discussions with people, even basic discussions. So I think I was really wiped out. I do remember there being some sort of like get to know Boston thing, but I don't really remember what it was. And I do remember there being a party, and that was really fun. And that was my MCO interview. Then later I flew back and got some stuff done. Then I did my UC Irvine interview. And again, so I'm not going to be really repeating this whole like cycle again. It's the same thing. You have dinner the night you come in. I drove to UC Irvine. You have dinner the night you come in, and then, you know, you have your interviews the next day. And so I just remember that second day. I loved my interviews. They were so much fun. But it was really interesting because a lot of my interviewers were actually from Harvard. They had gotten their PhDs from Harvard and were saying like, we would love to have you here, but also Harvard is a great place to get trained and you should go. And so that was kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting that, but I really appreciated the honesty that these faculty members had, and I gained a tremendous respect for them. And I wouldn't ever be opposed to going back to UC Irvine. I loved it. The thing I didn't like was the program director. He was just really snippy and sarcastic, and anytime I would ask like any legitimate question, like, does this program cover health insurance? He was just like very snippy with me, and like every biology PhD program gives you health insurance, which A, not necessarily true. B, they had given us a pamphlet that made it look like we had to pay, so I was just asking a question. I remember just feeling like really dismissed and like he didn't actually care. Also, it was kind of a logistical nightmare. I just felt like the program director and I were gonna have problems. You know, I loved everything else about the program, but if you don't connect with the person who's running your program, you're not gonna have a good time. Though I did have a really great like diversity dinner panel kind of thing. It was just like us getting to learn about the opportunities available to students who come from marginalized backgrounds and what resources there would be available for us as students to come help us acclimate to the campus before we start our research. So the very last night, they took us to this really awesome, I think it was a Spanish food place, but I can't remember, and we were dancing, and it was just really fun. Something that again put a bad taste in my mouth was the program director saying, like, if you are from the Los Angeles area, you are not allowed to stay at this hotel tonight, and you have to go home. And I understand that was because of like budget constraints, but at the same time, they were saying this, they didn't tell us this in advance. They told us this that night, and that night we ended like our time, you know, at dinner and dancing at like midnight, 1 a.m, and they were essentially like kicking us out if we lived in the area, which put a really bad taste in my mouth. Like, I do know that some programs have more money than others, but like this is not the place to showcase that. You really want your students to feel like they're going to be well supported in your program, not like that they're going to be constantly penny pinching and worrying about whether they can get their projects done because they don't have money. And so I think just overall, like, I was kind of put off by the program director's attitude towards everything, and I just knew we weren't going to get along. And you know, yeah, the program's only really important for like a year or two, but why would I want to make myself that miserable? Next was my interview with UC Merced. I loved my time at UC Merced. I had previously been there doing research in the past over the summer, and what I actually thought was super interesting about UC Merced's program is they had 2 tracks. They had a rotation track and I think just like a lab track, where one of them you would do rotations and the other one you were already accepted into a lab, and you would just like essentially skip the first year of rotations and go straight into lab work if you already knew who you wanted to work with, which is very unique, honestly. So I went and I did the rotation track interview just because I think it's really important to get experiences in other labs, even if you do know what faculty member you'd end up working with anyway, which in my case I would know who I was working with. It's very clear that UC Merced has a very great focus on their students and developing their students, especially like first-gen students or students from marginalized backgrounds, and like the people were all really great. So my interviews were just like the other interviews, same kind of questions were being asked. I just remember feeling really safe and having a lot of fun. This I'm sure was also helped by the fact that I already had friends at UC Merced, so I was kind of like different from the other interviews where I was just like making tons of friends and like being exhausted all the time. And there was a trip to Yosemite. I wish I could have gone, but I was just so tired. I just like needed to go home because I had a midterm coming up and needed to study for it. So unfortunately I didn't do that. But it's a warning to you all, like if you do a lot of interviews, you're going to be really tired. So if you get like tons and tons and tons of interviews, maybe don't go on all of them. Even if you're like not in school like I was, it was still really exhausting. And so finally I had my Stanford interview, and this was the one I was most excited about. I felt like I vibed with the faculty members the most when I was like on the website. It was in California. I feel like the program had a focus that I really enjoyed because Stanford has like an umbrella biosciences. So, you know, you apply to one particular program, and I applied to the general biology program. There's also options for like genetics, immunology, and all that. But for me, like I didn't know exactly what I wanted to study in that moment. I just knew that I, you know, needed to explore more labs. I just liked that there was a broad focus in the curriculum. And for me, that was just really important. I didn't want to pigeonhole myself into something like very quickly. I wanted to learn about a broad variety of topics and then go ahead. The way Stanford's interview works is they have all of their biosciences interviews at the exact same time. So it felt really big. They put us in this really, really fancy hotel. Like, I was just amazed. I think while UC Merced had the comfiest mattress hotel, I was very pleased. That was my favorite hotel. This one was the bougiest, and it was really cool to even be like in it. And so I remember feeling kind of overwhelmed at first because it was like all of the Ph.D. biosciences programs all at one time. And I think it was really good from like a getting to know people perspective, but at the same time I had done tons of interviews before and I was really tired, and there weren't many people at this interview that I had seen on my other interviews. There were some, but only one person I really like stuck to, and that person was in applying to my program too, so we kind of just like stuck to each other. And so the dinner was great. I had a great time. And then the interviews the next day, wow. So generally, all of the programs, I had 3 to 4 interviewers. Stanford gave me 8, and that was very common. The interviews were taken place over 2 days. And actually, I think the most I saw was someone had 11, but I heard that someone had 12, which is a lot. That is a lot. And a lot of these interviews were like, 20 minutes? So it was just right when you were getting in the vibe, you had to leave. And so that was interesting. That was very different. And so the way Stanford's interview was organized was that you were kind of in this general area for the biology program. I think it was like a home base, not really its office, but you were in the general area of where most of the interviewers are going to be. When you had your interview, your host would take you, and my host was really great. And then when you didn't have your interview, you could just like chill in this area. There were tons of snacks and you could talk to people. And then they had like optional sessions where you could learn about the program. And this was the only school that didn't have like a learn about our program, like mandatory session where they kind of just broke everything down. I think I felt very disconnected from the program coordinators. I felt like, like there was a session to learn about like the classes you were going to take, and I went, but the fact that it was optional was really weird to me. And also like, I just like didn't feel like I connected to them. I didn't feel like they were around, which sucked. What I would find is that like while people weren't interviewing, they were chilling, but it was hot. We were all just waiting outside for like very long extended periods of time, and it was honestly kind of awkward because all of us were tired, and what could we do? Eat snacks, make more small talk, like what's going on? I remember kind of being with my friend. I met him at BBS, and the entire time we were like, so how are you feeling about Stanford versus like BBS? And like every time we would talk, we would get closer and closer to like loving BBS and like just not feeling Stanford. I think for me it was really how big and disconnected it felt. It was weird because the program wasn't that big, but it felt huge. Like it felt like no one would really even knew I existed there, which is ironic because I went to the biggest program and I feel great there. I felt like supported there. And so I don't think that was the case for all of Stanford's programs. That was just the case for my interview, and I don't know if that was just like a really weird year or what. I had great conversations with the people interviewing, but I was just really tired, and the fact that I couldn't connect with the program coordinators in the end was a big no-no to me, honestly. I had a great time with the interviewers, though I did interview with, I think, one of the heads of the program, the like head faculty, and I just felt like he wasn't really interested in me, probably because I didn't like come from like a big name school or whatever, or like, I don't know what it was. And then also, Stanford was the only school I went to that like actively just shat all over Harvard. Pardon my language, but I just felt this insecurity that was very clear. They're like, oh yeah, Harvard's this, Harvard's that. And I also talked to a very famous professor, and I mostly enjoyed my conversation with him, but he said, is Harvard doing a great job of hiding you from the snake pit it really is? And I was shocked. That was quite a thing to say, and it made me think a lot about Harvard, which I think was good. But I didn't feel like Stanford was selling itself to me. The vibe I was getting was that Stanford knew it was hot shit, and how dare we even consider another program, And of course, I'm not saying this is what the program actually thinks, that the faculty think this, everything is different. Like, there are faculty members like that everywhere, and there are kind faculty members everywhere. I had a phenomenal, 6 interviews with everyone else, and I could see myself working with them. But I just didn't like that there was that insecurity there. I also didn't like how Silicon Valley culture bled into the school a lot. That's just a personal thing. I'm not into biotech. I'm not into entrepreneurship. That's just not the way I function. And I just felt that there was that culture there that, wasn't going to be for me. I think the thing that really threw me off though was there was a diversity lunch, which, you know, I think all of the schools had. I actually don't think BBS had one, though it was incorporated later. But there were people there that told me they were confused as to why they got invites. I'm not one to like look around and be like, oh, what's this person doing at a diversity event? Because, you know, there are many reasons people, you know, could be in marginalized groups or whatever it was. But there were people who were like, I don't know why I got an invite. Like, I come from an incredibly wealthy university, incredibly wealthy family. Like, I don't feel marginalized in any way, but I got this invite. And I was like, okay, well, you know, I guess, like, Stanford has a very different definition of diversity than I'm used to institutions having. Okay. But then, I know this is gonna sound petty, so petty, but the food was nasty. Like, you can't have, like, a diversity lunch and just have disgusting food, especially if you're gonna have a lot of people of color who are already used to having diversity lunches kind of be the only time in the program where you actually get, like, really well-seasoned food. And so it was funny because Stanford was my top choice when I applied. Like, I was convinced this was the program for me. I loved the philosophy, I loved the faculty members. But when I actually went, the vibe I got was very different. And again, it doesn't mean all of Stanford is like that. It's just the way I felt, my gut was just telling me this is not my school. You know, it could be perfect for someone else. And like, I'm not saying it's a bad program by any means, but just like me personally, it wasn't my thing. And so, interestingly enough, like, while I was on my BBS interviews, I was like interrogating, I was like, I don't think this school's gonna be for me because I mostly applied to like small schools and like all this stuff. But my list ended up inverting, where Harvard BBS became my top choice and Stanford actually just kind of sank to around the bottom given my choices. So I got into all of the schools I interviewed at, which I was very grateful for, and I ended up starting to choose between. That is going to be a whole other video that I'm going to put out later when it's time to start making decisions. But meanwhile, I hope this was helpful. It was something that was very highly requested, and I hope that you got what you wanted out of it. A lot of people have been asking me, like, what particular questions will programs ask you? And I just think that depends on the faculty member and the types of faculty members the program recruits. Generally, if it's a PhD program, they're going to ask you about your research for sure, like 100%. So if I have any advice for you in terms of the actual interview process, just know your work. No, you don't have to like know anything about the other professors' work. In my experience, I didn't read any of their papers, and they ended up like talking to me about their research as if I knew like zero about it, because that's where you should always start when you're describing your research to someone who's not in your field. And so I just focused on my work and I just had a genuine conversation. I think that is why I got in. I didn't try and pretend I was better than I was, because, you know, I'm not a perfect applicant. You know, I had my strengths, I had my weaknesses, just like everyone else. And, you know, be yourself. I know that's like the most cliche thing, but people can sense when you're not being yourself, and they just want to know, like, who is in this program? Like, who are potentially people that I could be working with, and who are graduate students I would want to attract? And I think both being very prepared about my own work and knowing everything about the published work I had, but also just being not nervous and just being myself and treating these people not like they were celebrities, but just like regular people, my colleagues that were going to help train me. I think that's what got me in. Thank you for watching this very long video. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them down below. If you had a very different interview experience, I would also love to hear about it, especially in the coming week. I want to wish you the very best of luck with all of your interviews. I'd love to hear how they go, how your experience was, and everything. Just one last thing, if you have a bad interview, don't let that completely, you know, ruin your mood. There were some people who, you know, didn't have good interviews, but still got into programs. There were some people who didn't have good interviews and didn't get into the programs. And although I personally didn't have that experience, I would have told myself the same thing as I told myself when I didn't get into MIT or UCLA, which was just like, that just meant I'm not a good fit for the program. It doesn't mean I'm a terrible student, I'm a bad person. Like, I'm incapable, all this stuff. It just meant that, maybe I'm not a good fit. Thank you all for watching. I'm really looking forward to hearing your stories, and thank you so much again for posting your stories on my other videos. I really love hearing where you are all at in the process, and I'm really hoping to hear more as interview season continues. I have a bunch of videos that I'll be releasing very soon, but eventually in the coming weeks I will be releasing a video about how I made my graduate school decision. If you found this video helpful at all, please like and please subscribe. I always love to have my subscribers come back to other videos and update me on where they are in their application process, in their PhD process, and it's really just great getting to have conversations with you all. I wish you all a very happy interview season, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you all soon.